Welcome to the Free Titan. Today I'm going to continue this series of talks about the planets and their incarnations in Greek mythology. And today I'll be continuing with the planet Mercury and his incarnation as Hermes, who is a very entertaining figure who plays a prominent role in much of Greek mythology. And again, as before, these stories about him and his tricks and his cleverness and his role as a messenger give us a lot of insight into his astrological application as Mercury. So whether you're interested in Greek mythology, human psychology, and or astrology, this connection between the planet Mercury and its astrological significations and the Greek god Hermes can be of great interest to us and can deepen our understanding of any of these aforementioned fields. So, brief introduction. Astrologically, Mercury governs the fifth energy center of the throat and governs all of the functions of the throat. So especially and predominantly communication. The mind is where we enter into the world of ideas. And so for something to be born in the physical world, it first has to be imagined in the mind, whether that's a railroad, an airplane, a car, a combustion engine, a bow and arrow, a plow, anything first sort of to be created in the flesh or in the physical has to be first imagined or dreamed of in the mind. So that being said, there's infinite numbers of inventions waiting to be had. All of this really already exists in the world of ideas. Anything we can imagine probably can exist. There's just this one problem of bridging the gap between the world of ideas and the physical world. And there's a lot of intellectual challenges and physical challenges perhaps even political challenges that have to be surmounted and overcome before an idea can exist physically. So, I'm sure if you studied any of this sort of most famous inventions, you would find, that the inventors had a long struggle in order to turn this dream into a reality physically. And this is the role of Mercury, is like bridging this gap between the pure mind and the faculties which would craft something into a physical existence. So as the throat, even anatomically, we can see that the throat is a bridge between the world of the mind and the world of the body, the world of thought and the world of action, whether it's with our feet or our hands or our legs. The intellect, which is Mercury, which is it's not physically the throat necessarily, but the intellect is governed by the planet Mercury in astrology, and so this is like, when you imagine Hermes, if you're familiar at all with Greek mythology, Hermes is a son of Zeus, and his primary function in many of these stories is to be a messenger who shuttles messages between the gods and the mortal realm, or even demigods and other gods. But he serves Father Zeus, which is this god deity figure who governs the Olympus, the sort of heaven world in Greek mythology. So Zeus rules, or is in charge of, is put above all of the other gods. And so Mercury, or Hermes, is one of his primary servants. And so Mercury goes and sort of makes the creator, the god figure's wishes real by relaying and shuttling messages and wishes of the predominant god to other actors on the world stage, whether they're other gods, human beings, demigods, heroes, monsters, cyclopses. In the Odyssey, Hermes relays messages between heaven and Circe, who's a sort of witch demigoddess who traps Odysseus for a long time on his voyage home. He also shuttles messages between Olympus and Calypso, a nymph who Odysseus stays with for a number of years during his 10-year voyage home after Troy. And so he's kind of this really important figure in playing out the drama in creation, at least mythologically. But in terms of modern mankind and how he functions in our day-to-day life, he plays this important role of verbalizing and expressing our ideas. And so people with good communication skills are really good at articulating their ideas. Now, you could have a very high level intellect and very highly evolved communication skills and really have sort of a poorly functioning mind with not very good ideas, not very profound, original, or clearly imagined ideas. But you could present them very well, and you could probably make a lot of people think you're very smart. So being gifted with good communication skills, unlike what our sort of world places value on, is not necessarily the best indication of intelligence, but it makes you comprehensible to other people, and it certainly gives you the ability to manipulate other people, to express your ideas to other people. So good communication skills is often very good at convincing other people of your own ideas, but it doesn't necessarily give you the right idea. And so throughout human history, many people have had the best ideas, but were unable to articulate them and convince other people of their ideas' merits. And their ideas are usually not the ones that are chosen by their peers. So this is another function of Mercury or Hermes in our day-to-day life that is much more relatable to all of us individually, because whether it's in a relationship or a business context, oftentimes the person with the gift of gab, or the ability to articulate and communicate and convince other people, is the one who rises. And in our society, especially in Western society, in Europe and North America, we're so intellectually driven, so left brain dominant, that this mercurial mind is probably valued more than it should be. So, the people who really have a lot of power in our society, like lawyers and bankers and politicians, these are very high level Mercury people. Because Mercury is good at calculations. If you're a banker, for example, it's good at working with words if you're a lawyer or a politician. And it's good at making bad ideas seem like good ideas. It's good at obfuscating the truth if you want to. And so, especially I think in the United States, Canada, most of the sort of developed Western world, Mercury may be the most important planet right now in our society. And even if you look at, the United States has so much military power, but our technology and our might is often derived more through technology and intellectual inventions than it is through, strength of arms, or like physical arms, right? Like arms of the soldiers. As strength, and through most of human history, that at least in the last 3,000 years or so that we have recorded, military strength was often, yes, there was a lot of technology involved, but more than now, the actual fitness, strength, discipline, and physical training of the soldiers played a more important role than it does today. Because today, you can order drone strikes. You have, for example, air superiority determines to a huge degree in a sort of traditional conflict who has the upper hand. And air superiority doesn't really have to do with physical fitness at all, right? It has to do with technology and technological superiority. Missiles, bombs, fighter jets, artillery. This all has to do with technology much more than physical strength. So even physical might in our modern world is so much derived from intellectual applications, because all of these technological inventions, there's a component of Mars to it. Any sort of martial application or martial entity is connected to Mars, but yet the intellect is really what's driving this. Like the intellect is what's empowering these inventions to exist physically, right? This intellect, which is the bridge between the world of ideas and the world of the physical world, this is the realm of Mercury. And, especially in the United States, we're a culture that's so focused on innovation, invention, cleverness. This is all ruled by and governed by Mercury. And when you look at the people who have, so many of the people who have the highest salaries in our world, engineers, lawyers, doctors, bankers, it wasn't always like this. And, these are all high level Mercury intellectual people. So this is kind of the background about what Mercury means to us individually, what Mercury means to our society. And obviously it has, when we understand this, you can also understand a lot of the frustration of people who are very intuitive and are so intuitive and so deeply perceptive that a lot of times their ideas are difficult to convert into words that are comprehensible to other people. Like some of the really high level philosophers were able to articulate very, very, very refined and esoteric ideas in a clear way. But also many of them really fail at this. Like Kant and Hegel are famous for being who are very famous philosophers. They're famous for being almost impossible to understand. And so whether or not they had good ideas doesn't matter if you can't be comprehensible to others. Now, some of these guys just laid the groundwork for future philosophers who are much more comprehensible. But the point is, in a world that values intellect so much, in a world that values the ability to articulate ideas so much, in a world that is so unpoetic, unmusical, unaesthetic, the people who really have pure intelligence, not intellectual intelligence, but pure perceptive intelligence, aesthetic sensitivity, empathy, emotional intelligence, they often get pushed to the margins of society, unfortunately, even though they probably have more to offer to our world, simply because they're not comprehensible intellectually. Like their merits are not really easy to quantify, even though what they bring to bear in the world is so valuable. It's almost impossible for us to intellectually comprehend how valuable their gifts are to us. The gifts of healers and poets, and sages and prophets and people who can really change humanity. Because the intellect on its own is incapable of changing human consciousness necessarily. It could shift it, but if you look at what really inspires people to be better from a spiritual perspective or a moral perspective, it's more of like a pure intuition or a pure love or empathy. These are the things I think that actually can improve humanity. The intellect and its applications with inventions and, wordplay and, litigation, these could give a human being a leg up on another human being, but it's not necessarily improving society as a whole. Although certainly technology has made our lives easier, it hasn't necessarily made us better morally or from a basic human level. It hasn't made us better human beings. It's given us free time, and that could be a big advantage if we're using it in a productive way. But as we know, most people don't spend all this extra free time improving themselves as individuals. So it cuts both ways. But this is a backdrop to Mercury. Now to transition back into Hermes and Mercury's mythological counterpart, I will read a couple paragraphs from this book on myths that I've been referring to quite a bit. So, many tales are told too of crafty Hermes, son of Zeus, by the nymph Maya. So crafty is a really operative word here and a key word. And it describes very well the power players in our world, whether it's a billionaire business owner, a crafty, eloquent politician, a clever lawyer, an astute banker, right? We can already start to see the parallels between Mercury or Hermes and the sort of power players in our world. From the moment he came into being, his restless nature was plain. It is said that on the very day of his birth, he found and killed a tortoise, scooped out the soft flesh, and strung the hollow shell to make the first lyre, which is an ancient musical instrument. Then that same night, he stole the cattle of the archer god Apollo to mislead any who should give chase. He drove the cattle backwards, another example of his cleverness, while walking backwards himself and disguising his barefoot baby prince with oversized sandals strapped to his feet like snowshoes. So straight out of the womb, he was already a very clever personality. But it's interesting because as we're sort of reflecting on all the clever people in our world with so much power, in this world, Mercury does not have that much power. In a more ancient world where technology was not so critical, where the intellect was not so dominant, was not such a dominant force in society and the mechanisms of sort of political power, Hermes is really not considered to be that big of a power player, like Ares, Athena, Hera, Zeus. These characters all have much more power in this world than he does. Even Aphrodite, I would say, is more powerful than Hermes. Hermes, in terms of power, does not really factor in that much. Also because usually he's carrying out the will of Zeus, which is a religious figure in a lot of ways, actually, because he, in addition to political power, he represents religious morality. So I'll continue with one other paragraph here. Hermes is the god of the sudden and unexpected, the elusive and edgy. He governs thievery. So elusive and edgy, this describes in astrological terms the sign of Gemini. So Hermes has two sides, the positive and the negative. The positive, more masculine expression would be found embodied in the sign of Gemini, which is, as it says, elusive and edgy, articulate and fun-loving. And Virgo, which is kind of less expressed through the personality of Hermes, but Virgo is very good with communication, organization. It's perfectionistic. So Hermes specifically expresses more of the qualities of the masculine qualities of Mercury, as embodied in the sign of Gemini. He governs thievery, trade, and bargaining, messages and mischief, invention and inspiration. So there it is again, invention. We're talking about technology. A technology-governed society or world and culture, economy, is so, Mercury, Hermes factors so strongly into any society that's really values technology and relies on technology so highly. He's the god. He is the restlessness god of he is the restless god of magic and of luck. His countenance is never still. So he's very restless, and this again, this describes exactly Western society. We're so restless. We're so edgy. We're so possessed of invention and technology. Our society is so overwhelmingly governed by Mercury. So enough of that. In Greek mythology, however, he is not, like I said, as powerful, and his function is probably more of what it appropriately should be, which is subordinate to a god with more values, more sort of guidelines for how to live and how to conduct oneself, because Mercury on its own doesn't have a lot of emotional depth. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of empathy or emotional wisdom. Like I referenced the philosopher Kant earlier. He was famous for saying that empathy is the foundation of all morality. And empathy is an emotional quality which could be associated with like the moon or the heart, perhaps even Jupiter or the sun, but Mercury certainly not. And so without this emotional depth and empathy, it's really hard to derive good moral conduct. So Hermes doesn't necessarily misbehave that much, although he is known for being edgy and full of mischief. But he does misbehave, but he's mostly known for his role as a messenger. And so he works for Zeus, who represents, which is a god, which is known for, like in astrological terms, Jupiter is known for morality and religion, at least religious codes of conduct, you could say. So there's one other reference here to the Trojan War, because Hermes plays a pretty important role in both of Homer's works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And during the Trojan War, I'm reading here, it was Hermes who was always sent to steal something that was otherwise unobtainable, because he was the god of thievery and cleverness and sneakiness. Before the sea nymph Thetis persuaded her son Achilles to stop mutilating the corpse of Hector, who is the Prince of Troy, who, if you watch the movie Troy, this is when Brad Pitt as Achilles kills, I think his name is Eric Bana, who's the actor who plays Hector. The gods considered that the simplest solution might be to let Hermes steal the broken body. This is just another anecdote of how his role was imagined in ancient literature and mythology. So, but to move on to another point, Hermes also has a very close association with Aphrodite. And in astrology, the easiest way to understand this is the connection between Mercury, which is the planet of communication and intellect, and Venus, which is the planet of the heart and of sensitivity to, among other things, aesthetic beauty. So when you can combine a very articulate disposition and a refined and evolved intellect with the heart, whether it's an attunement to musical beauty, poetic beauty, physical beauty, then you really can have something special. And so a lot of great writers and poets, even people who are just known for their physical beauty, whether they're models, or like gifted with their voice, because the voice is governed by Mercury, but to make it beautiful, usually there's some introduction of the qualities of Venus to it. And so this association between Venus and Mercury, the heart and the throat, is captured in Greek mythology as well. And so I'm going to read to you an introduction to this. So it's talking about Hermes and his gifts, but then it goes on to say, Hermes' greatest passion was for the love goddess Aphrodite, indicating the profound necessity for him of the influence of Aphrodite Venus in his expression. The two sons that are attributed to them were both renowned for their unusual sexuality. And so that, whether or not it's unusual, I think is beside the point, but the fact that there is a sexual aspect to the combination of Mercury and Venus is worth noting, because Venus on her own, just as Mercury on his own, can be quite one-dimensional, right? Like a very gifted lawyer who has an incredible intellect and an incredible gift with words, but who has no moral compass, no intuitive perception, no empathy. You know, that's a weapon that will likely be wielded for less than ideal purposes. Similarly, a woman or a man who is profoundly beautiful and sensual, but does not have a reasoning capacity, may use their sensuality, again, for less than ideal purposes. However, when you combine these two forces and qualities, you can really have something special, because Mercury is also the ability to reason, and Venus is among other things very beautiful and sensual. But when you have this refinement of Mercury and this capacity for intellectual calculation of Mercury, and this ability to understand the consequences of one's actions before they are acted, with a capacity for sort of sensitivity to aesthetic beauty, then for love, obviously, because Venus is the goddess of love, then you have something very special. Then you can have a refined expression of beauty, a refined expression, and a more calculating is not really the ideal expression, but it could be, but a fusion, a synergy of the intellect with the sort of sensuality and desire for aesthetic beauty of Venus. And then you can have a higher expression, a higher consciousness, let's say, expression in a romantic context, and in a sexual context, and in an artistic context, whether it's through, writing a book of history, or writing a book of poetry, or singing, or expressing oneself romantically, or just being a channel for divine messages, or some sort of inspired message, whether it's through poetry or just insight into the world. This happens when the messenger god is inspired and influenced by the heart and love and a sensitivity to beauty. And so this is important because especially in astrology, when you look at Venus or when you look at Mercury, Venus to an extreme often has a very heavy shadow associated with her. Mercury to an extreme has, it doesn't have to be a heavy shadow, because it, like when Venus is expressed so strongly, right, this sensual attractiveness is omnipresent, it's always there. But Mercury, when it's expressed strongly, could have a heavy shadow if it reached a level of power. If it didn't have a platform for power, the gift to use words well is not always just on its own powerful. Like some guy or girl who doesn't have really a platform to stand on, who just goes around running their mouth trying to manipulate people. Yeah, they're capable of some harm, but oftentimes there's no weight behind just intellect. It's kind of dry and paper thin without some sort of backing in an institutional sense, or some bigger context to lend it power. But Venus always has power. Venus always has power. Physical attractiveness and sensuality always has power. I would say, well, I don't, but and so on one hand, this is a testament to the power of Venus, but on the other hand, going back to my original point, it's I'm trying to touch on how when these two planets are not influenced by something else, and this is true of all planets, but in this context, Venus and Mercury, there's very obvious drawbacks to having a very, very, very strong Venus without sort of refinement or sort of a, a highly functioning, or a sort of decently functioning intellect who can, think about consequences of actions and things like that. And similarly for Mercury, if there's no moral compass, if he's not serving Zeus, that is Jupiter, or if he's not influenced by love or beauty, Mercury can really be very limited on his own. And another way of thinking about this is in Greek mythology, Mercury is usually depicted serving something higher, serving someone more powerful, serving some idea with more merit than just pure intellect or pure eloquence. Usually his function is serving the god Zeus. But that being said, the other way of thinking about Mercury is if he's simply elevated by an association or a sensitivity to beauty and love, he can channel a lot of incredible insight and grace and beauty into the world.